Good evening. My name is Preeti Anaprapan R. Karunanidhi, and in this video I will be exploring the beneficiary principle and examining whether it operates with unnecessary rigidity. This video will contain the core features of the principle and its underlying rationale before exploring related concepts such as the rule against perpetuity and the key exceptions that have developed over time. Most importantly, I'll assess whether the rigidity of the beneficiary principle remains justified in modern trust law or whether it imposes limitations that are no longer necessary. The beneficiary principle occupies a central and enduring position in the law of trust. It is the rule that for a non-charitable trust to be valid, there must be identifiable human beneficiaries who are capable of enforcing the trustee's obligations. However, the confusion that comes up with these types of trust is who is capable of enforcing the trust against the trustee. In Leahy and Attorney General of New South Wales, the court stated that a trust may be created for the benefit of persons, but not for a purpose or object unless the purpose or object is to be beneficial. The beneficiary principle was most famously expressed in Morris and Bishop of Durham, where it was held that there must be someone in whose favor the court can decree performance. In this case, the trust was created for objects of benevolence and liberality, but it was uncertain as to who the trust was created for and who the beneficiaries were. In the case of Morris and Bishop of Durham, it was also seen that it is important to clearly identify a beneficiary due to the power invested in beneficiaries to hold the trustee to account. There are two important ideas in regards to the beneficiary principle. Firstly, the trustees are only liable if there are beneficiaries who can make sure that the trustees perform their obligation. The second idea is that the beneficiary must have a proprietary right in the trust property. It is this right that gives the beneficiary the right to petition the court if the trustees fail to perform their duties. This is based on the rule in Saunders and Vautier. The rule established in this case provides that a term of trust can be discontinued if all of the beneficiaries of the trust are of full legal rights. These ideas indicate that the beneficiaries are the only ones that are able to enforce the trust once the trust is created. In the case of Reher's Will Trust, it was said that a trust for a non-charitable purpose, as distinct from a trust for individuals, is clearly void because there are no beneficiaries. Moving on, the rationale behind the beneficiary principle lies in the inherent uncertainty of private purpose trusts. In such arrangement, the trustee holds legal ownership of the trust property. Without proper oversight, there is a risk that the trustee may act in bad faith and disregard their fiduciary responsibilities. To prevent this, equity does not recognize these types of trusts unless the courts are able to enforce their proper execution. For the courts to exercise such control, the nature of the trustee's obligations must be clearly and certainly defined. Without this clarity, judicial enforcement becomes impossible, which is why certainty of objects is a necessary requirement. As explained in the article Developing the Obligation Characteristics of a trust is fundamentally an obligation and requires the trustee to owe duties to identifiable beneficiaries who, in turn, have the corresponding right to hold the trustees accountable for fulfilling those duties. It also follows that when a trust has a beneficiary, that beneficiary can hold the trustee accountable, thereby preventing the trustee from acting dishonestly or irresponsibly. This is the core rationale of the beneficiary principle. Lord Eldon, in affirming the decision in Morris and Bishop of Durham, emphasized that the beneficiary principle exists primarily to prevent the trustee from mismanaging the trust. A clear example is found in Re Endicott, where the testator attempted to leave a significant sum of money to the North Towton Parish Council for the purpose of providing a useful memorial to myself. This purpose was too vague and lacked an identifiable beneficiary, making it unenforceable. Another justification for the beneficiary principle is to prevent trust from continuing indefinitely. This is addressed through two rules through two rules of perpetuity: the rule against remoteness of vesting and the rule against re-alienation. The rule against remoteness of vesting deals with the issue of beneficial interests that might not vest within a specified time frame. Under English law, trusts that could potentially last for an indefinite period are not enforceable. According to the common law rule against perpetuities, any interest or estate must vest, if at all, no later than 21 years after the death of a person alive at the time the interest was created. Moreover, both the identity of the person and the extent of their interest must be determinable within the time frame as explained in Thompson. As a result, all equitable interests must vest within time limits set by the common law perpetuity period. According to this rule, any trust that continues beyond 21 years is considered invalid. The second element of perpetuity rules is the rule against inalienability. The second rule invalidates certain arrangements that effectively restrict the transfer or use of property for extended periods. A gift is deemed inalienable if it cannot be sold, transferred, or otherwise disposed of. Non-charitable purpose trusts are often long-lasting, and one key reason courts have refused to uphold them is because they do not contribute to economic productivity. Such trusts tie up resources without offering tangible benefits to individuals or the wider community. Lastly, courts may also strike down private purpose trusts on the grounds of public policy. If a trust is established for a purpose the court views as inappropriate or frivolous, it may be declared invalid. This reasoning is especially common in cases where trust purpose appears eccentric or meaningless. For example, in Brown and Burdett, the court invalidated such a trust on the basis that it served no useful function. Despite the general application of the beneficiary principle, there are cases where courts have upheld trusts without human beneficiaries. In Re Endicott, Lord Eversham referred to these exceptions or anomalies to the rule requiring human beneficiaries. He identified 5 recognized categories: trust for building monuments or grave, trust for saying masses, trust for the care of specific animals, trust for unincorporated associations, and various other miscellaneous cases. The first 3 types are often called trusts of imperfect obligation because, although they are considered valid, the trustee cannot be legally compelled to carry them out. As Roxburgh J. remarked in Re Astor, these trusts are essentially concessions to human weakness of sentiment. Trusts for the care of specific animals have been upheld despite being non-charitable purpose trusts. For example, in Re Dinn, a trust for maintaining the testator's horses and dogs was found valid since it did not breach the rule against perpetuity. Similarly, in Pettingil and Pettingil, a trust for the upkeep of a horse was enforced because the residuary beneficiary could ensure its execution. In Re Hooper, a trust for grave maintenance was also upheld as it was limited to a period to as long as the trustees can do so. In contrast, in Musset and Bingle, 2 bequests were made, one for £300 to erect a memorial which was upheld as a valid exception, and another for £200 to maintain the memorial which was voided for breaching the rule against perpetuity. In Pittbright and Salway, a trust to maintain a child's burial enclosure as long as the law permits was deemed valid as it conformed to the perpetuity rules. In Byrne and Keene, the House of Lords accepted that a trust for saying masses was valid. These trusts are enforceable because they meet the requirements of certainty and do not breach the perpetuity rule. Although valid, they are not enforceable in the traditional sense. Because of their recognized status, James Brown has proposed reforming the law to allow testators to appoint a specific enforcer for such trusts, helping to address concerns about enforceability. Another notable exception to the beneficiary principle involves trusts established to support fox hunting. In Re Thompson, a trust created to fund a particular hunt was upheld even though no individual directly benefited. This case is particularly interesting because the court permitted enforcement of a non-enforceable trust by recognizing that the college, as the residuary beneficiary, could claim any unused funds and could apply to the court if the money was misapplied. Now, let's explore the rigidity. In Re Astor's Settlement Trust, the court invalidated a trust aimed at promoting the preservation of the independence and integrity of newspapers, on the grounds that the beneficiaries could not be clearly identified. While this outcome aligned with the strict application of the beneficiary principle, the court also ruled that the trust's purpose lacked significant and sufficient certainty. This implies that a more definite and specific purpose might have been deemed valid. In Re Endicott, the court acknowledged early exceptions to the rule against non-charitable purpose trusts. This included trusts for the care of particular animals, the construction or upkeep of graves or memorials, the saying of private Catholic masses, and the support of fox hunting. These exceptions have been described as concessions to human sentiment. The Court of Appeal emphasized that such exceptions should only be upheld in future cases under circumstances that closely mirror these precedents. However, this restrictive view becomes questionable when contrasted with more lenient interpretations that focus on identifying definite beneficiaries. For instance, in Re Leahy, the court applied a strict interpretation of the beneficiary principle, finding no valid trust because the property was given for the general purposes of a Carmelite order rather than for named individuals. By contrast, in Re Danley, Mr. Justice Goff adopted a more liberal approach. He upheld a trust involving land designated for the use of employees, holding that the employees qualified as identifiable beneficiaries, thus satisfying the beneficiary principle. This raises questions about the rationale behind Re Leahy. It is unclear why the court in that case did not adopt a similar reasoning to that in Re Danley, considering that members of a religious order, like employees, are individual people who could be clearly identified. In Re Grant's Will Trust, Mr. Justice Vinelot supported the stricter interpretation adopted in Re Leahy. In contrast, in Re Lipsinki, Mr. Justice Oliver, while acknowledging Re Leahy, took a more flexible approach. He ruled that if there are identifiable or ascertainable beneficiaries who receive an indirect benefit, then the strictness of Re Leahy need not apply. This more lenient approach raises questions about its compatibility with the Saunders and Vautier principle, as beneficiaries receiving an indirect benefit don't necessarily possess a direct proprietary interest in the trust property. It suggests that the beneficiary's property rights are essentially in limbo pending court validation of the trust. Nevertheless, the logic seems to be that once beneficiaries are identifiable, their interest in the trust property is assumed whether that interest is direct or indirect. This line of reasoning could also extend to discretionary trusts. Rather than simply holding a personal right against the trustee, a discretionary beneficiary may be seen to have an indirect interest in the trust property in line with reasoning in Re Danley. This approach also aligns with the certainty of objects test laid out in McPhail and Dalton, which requires that it must be possible to determine with certainty whether someone falls within the class of beneficiaries as long as at least some of them can be identified. The legal complexity surrounding unincorporated associations highlight a significant challenge. Such associations lack legal personality and therefore cannot hold or enforce proprietary rights under a trust. As a result, even if a settlor intends to benefit the association, the trust may fail because there is no legal entity to hold the property, and the rule in Saunders and Vautier cannot apply due to the absence of a clear beneficiary. However, adopting the reasoning in Re Danley changes the outcome. That case suggests the property isn't being held for an abstract purpose, but rather for the benefit of individual members of the association, thereby satisfying the beneficiary principle and rendering the trust valid. Given the contested nature of Re Danley, courts have explored alternative ways to bypass the beneficiary principle altogether. In Re Lipsinki, Mr. Justice Oliver reasoned that where the transfer gives beneficiaries absolute ownership of the property, it amounts to a gift rather than a trust, so the beneficiary principle is irrelevant. Another approach stems from Neville Estates and Madden and Re Rich's Will Trust, where the court suggested using a contractual framework. This relies on the internal agreement among members of the association, which governs its operation and the use of its property, thereby eliminating the need to meet traditional trust or gift requirements. Ultimately, the validity of property transfers to unincorporated associations depends on which legal interpretation the court adopts. Of these, only the Reed-Danley approach can validate a trust under the beneficiary principle. In conclusion, Alistair Hudson's explanation in the book Equity and Trust of the beneficiary principle is effective in scenarios where beneficiaries are clearly identifiable and can assert their legal and proprietary rights in court. In cases where the trust seems to serve an abstract purpose, courts have often taken a more interpretive and purposive approach, reframing such trusts as one meant to benefit particular individuals, thus aligning them with the beneficiary principle. This reasoning extends to discretionary trusts and unincorporated associations. For any such trust to be valid, the intended beneficiaries must be evident, or the trust will fail regardless how flexible the interpretation may be. In these instances, court must be willing to adopt a purposive approach to uphold the transfers that might otherwise be void due to uncertainty. Where such an approach is unsuitable, court should consider alternative legal mechanisms to give effect to the transfer.